So in this final section of the lecture, we're going to look at the seller's remedies for the buyer breach. What remedies does the seller have available when the buyer fails to perform? Well, fortunately, the remedies are somewhat similar to a buyer's remedies, and we start with specific performance, a right to performance. Now, in the case of a buyer's specific performance, ordinarily that's payment of the contract price. So, right to performance in the case of a buyer breach means you got to pay the price. A right to avoid the contract because of a fundamental breach. So in the case of a fundamental breach, the buyer doesn't pay for the goods as it was required to do. The seller may elect to simply avoid the contract. If, in fact, the market price is much more than the contract price, the seller may instead choose to avoid the contract, to rescind the original agreement, and then take those goods out to the market and sell them to another party. So a seller may wish to avoid the contract completely. A right to cure we've already talked about. And finally, a right to money damages. Again, we'll spend a lot of time talking about money damages. So right now we look at we'll just look at it very briefly. All right. Seller's right to specific performance. A seller can demand performance according to the contract, and that means payment of the contract price. This usually will be the demand if the seller has already delivered the goods. Now, if the seller has not delivered the goods, that seller is going to have its obligation too. Remember, we talked about buyers. Buyers have an obligation to mitigate. And the buyer's obligation to mitigate means I have to go out and purchase substitute goods. Well, in the case of a buyer's breach, the seller has obligations. And that is resale of the goods. So I cannot simultaneously demand payment and go out and resell the goods. Nor can I simply leave the goods in the warehouse to rot while demanding payment from the buyer. Instead, I have an obligation to resell the goods, or to at least try to resell the goods. So mitigation by the seller means resale of the goods. So I must resell those goods. So therefore, specific performance is available, but generally it's going to be affected by this mitigation. Now, if there is no market for the goods, if I cannot sell the goods, maybe they were so specialized that only this particular buyer could use them, I may be able to demand full contract price. Nevertheless, I must be able to establish that there was no market, and therefore the market price of these particular goods was effectively zero. Remember, when we calculate money damages are generally going to be the difference between contract price and market price. Avoidance, again, the seller can avoid a contract if a buyer fails to take delivery or fails to pay the purchase price. The seller can walk away. Those are examples of a fundamental breach. Money damages. The general measure of money damages is the difference between contract price and market price. The reason being is those duties to mitigate. What's important is what did the contract call for, and because of a failure of performance, what harm did the respective parties suffer, either the buyer or the seller. And if your obligation is to purchase substitute goods at market price or resell goods at market price, our measure of damage is going to be the difference between the contract price and the market price.